Hello, Merry and fulfilling Christmas to all of you watching this video in 2017. This is a series of readings, the commentary, and a little bit of a homily for this day. It's the Eucharist, which is normally celebrated during the day. As you old-timers remember, there are three separate Eucharists on Christmas. Rarely do we get the middle one. There's the one at midnight, and rarely do you have a Eucharist at midnight. Since I left Renault, they don't have any midnight Eucharist anymore on Christmas, and I don't know any church around here that does. Might be interested because I know people who really would like a midnight Eucharist, but they've gone the way of modernity, I guess. But there is also a Eucharist at dawn. And I remember one year, as a student in Rome, I trekked through the cold to St. Anastasia's Church in Rome, which is a station church, at dawn on Christmas. They had no heat in that church, no electricity in that church. You stood around with candles or flashlights or something for a Eucharist at dawn. Very meaningful, but I doubt that many of our churches, if they don't have a midnight Eucharist, don't have a dawn Eucharist either on Christmas. And every other year I change. I'll have one year with the midnight Eucharist readings and another year with the readings during the day. This is the year of the readings during the day. So the first reading is from chapter 52 of Deutero-Isaiah. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings glad tidings, announcing peace, bearing good news, announcing salvation, and saying to Zion, your God is king. Hark, your sentinels raise a cry. Together they shout for joy, for they see directly before their eyes Yahweh restoring Zion. Break out together in song, O ruins of Jerusalem. For Yahweh comforts his people. He redeems Jerusalem. Yahweh has bared his holy arm in the sight of all the nations. All the ends of the earth will behold the salvation of our God. The second reading is that very famous section of the letter to the Hebrews, the very first verses of that letter to the Hebrews. By the way, I don't know any scholar who holds that Paul wrote the letter to the Hebrews. So if you're at church this morning and the lector says that, just give the old-fashioned Italian symbol, which is this. When you want to say something really didn't happen, just pull your eyelid down like this from the bottom and just say, it's not Paul, so stop trying to trick us into thinking it is. But here's the reading. Brothers and sisters, in times past, God spoke in partial and various ways to our ancestors through the prophets. In these last days, he has spoken to us through the Son, whom he made heir of all things, and through whom he created the universe, who is the refulgence of his glory, the very imprint of his being, and who sustains all things by his mighty word. When he had accomplished purification from sins, he took his seat at the right hand of the Majesty on high, as far superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, this day I have begotten you? Or again, I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. And again, when he leads the firstborn into the world, he says, let all the angels of God worship him. The word of the Lord. And the gospel is ultra familiar to all of us over 70. Every time we went to a Eucharist until the late 50s, I guess it was, we heard this gospel proclaimed as the last gospel. We servers always kind of liked it because we used to demonstrate our agility to race up and grab the book from one side of the altar at the end of Eucharist and put it on the other side. But here's the gospel that we rarely hear today, but very frequently heard way back when. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. A man named John was sent from God. He came for testimony to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came to be through him, but the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. But to those who did accept him, he gave power to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not by natural generation, nor by human choice, nor by man's decision, but of God. And the Word became flesh, and made his dwelling among us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, 'The one who is coming after me ranks ahead of me, because he existed before me.' From his fullness we have all received, grace in place of grace. Because while the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only Son, God, who is at the Father's side, has revealed him." The Gospel of the Lord. This is rather interesting that we have a feast that doesn't zero in on Jesus' death and resurrection. You can tell that this was not an early feast of the early church, because all those feasts revolve around dying and rising. I mentioned in the commentary this week that the most popular recording of all time, White Christmas, began rather innocently in 1941 and was not regarded as that important. Even in 1942, when they put it into the movie with Bing Crosby, Holiday Inn, it certainly didn't have a central place in that movie. Years later, in the 50s, they actually redid the movie, but this time, because of the song's popularity, they entitled the movie White Christmas. But it only got to be popular once World War II began, and guys were away from home at Christmas time, and then somehow White Christmas got to be rather symbolic of the pain they were undergoing. Even people who came from Southern California still sang White Christmas, which would be fun to accomplish. But in a way, we have to see that also with the birth of Jesus. The birth of Jesus only becomes significant because of his dying and rising. Something later made an event that happened earlier significant. And by not insisting that we zero in on that dying and rising, we really miss out on what the message of our sacred authors revolves around, in especially the Gospels and Paul's letters. We have to see, for instance, that the early church wasn't necessarily certain when Jesus became God. When you read the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans, it's very clear. Paul believed, when he wrote Romans probably in the 50s or so, late 50s, late 50s, that Jesus only became God when God raised Jesus from the dead. And in the first gospel, Mark's, in chapter 1, it's very clear Jesus only becomes God when he's baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. And when you read Matthew and Luke, Jesus appears to be God and human simultaneously in Mary's womb. It's only when we get to John, that famous chapter 1 that I just read, probably mid-90s when John's Gospel was written, that we speak about Jesus pre-existing as God. And so the question then becomes, when does God become a human being? The early Christians' question was, when does this human being become God? Ray Brown speaks about this in his very famous book, The Birth of the Messiah. He refers to it as the messianic moment. In other words, at what point does Jesus become God? The indication is that if Jesus is not God until his resurrection, is not God, like Mark says, until his baptism, No wonder there's no infancy narrative in Mark's gospel, or Paul never refers to it. They both believe he wasn't God at that time, so there wasn't anything exceptional about his birth, wasn't anything exceptional about his infancy. And so Matthew and Luke, who seem to both have him God in his mother's womb along with his humanity, he can have infancy narratives. He can have special things happen at his birth because of what we later know with the dying and rising of Jesus. That's why it's kind of nice when we read Deutero-Isaiah about the feet of the person who brings the good news. But the good news isn't that Jesus is born. The good news is Jesus is alive right now as a new creation. The good news is Jesus, by giving himself for others, was dying enough in that process to come back as a new creation later. Same thing he promised his followers would happen to them. That's why when it even speaks in the letter to the Hebrews about God revealing God's self, that's a long process every once in a while. All revelation doesn't take place instantaneously. And just like it took a while for Christians to understand when Jesus became God, it also takes a while to understand the significance of rising with Jesus. That doesn't happen instantaneously. And so if anything takes place Christmas, as you're listening to these particular readings and these commentaries and the homily on these readings, is we have to understand there was a reason Christmas was not celebrated for centuries in the early church. There was no need to celebrate it. It wasn't significant. What's significant is the dying and rising. That's what made his birth important for us to know about. If he had not died and risen, nobody would have remembered his birth. It would have been ludicrous. So you might have to be sort of a party pooper today, I guess. And even though you're celebrating Christmas, as we all are, don't get that involved in Christmas that we forget what the good news is actually all about. Thank you, and Merry Christmas again.